Hello, welcome to SuperMiata. Today we're going to talk about coaxial shock mounts. We're going to show you some examples, describe what they do differently than standard body mounts, and also Torrington bearings and how they affect spring function and shock function. So to define them, your OEM mounts, any OEM mount is going to be a body mount. An example would be, this is a shock for a 2006 to 2015 MX-5 Miata, an NC platform. So the spring is pushed up against the shock mount, and then the shock mount is attached, of course, to the body. So the spring is always basically pushing against the body. So if the shock swings side to side, if the shock swings like this, then the spring's going to be twisted. And it turns out that the shock actually does swing like that. All shocks do, because they are attached not to an elevator that goes straight up and down, but they're attached to a control arm, which basically swings like this. So it swings like that, and the shock swings back and forth. So the shock, as it's attached to the control arm, is going to have a little bit of rocking back and forth like this. And of course, the top mount isn't moving. So what that's doing to the spring is it's twisting it. It's basically taking that spring and twisting it like this. And what that does, of course, it puts a side load on the shock. So the shock is, of course, basically like a telescope, right? And think about the telescope. You want those to be in line so that it moves smoothly. So if you were to twist it like that or try to bend it, you're going to put load on those bushings, and there's going to be extra friction in the shock. It's going to change how the shock performs. And additionally, the spring rate, you lose spring rate linearity. And this is something that not a lot of people talk about, but it's very important for the spring as it compresses to have a nice linear spring rate. And an example would be, in fact, I'll do a little kind of a half chart here. So if you had a spring rate chart, when you put it on a tester and you compress it, it makes a nice linear line. So you have force, as you apply force and distance, it's a nice linear line. In other words, the force is nice and equal. It doesn't get like stiffer than softer and kind of vary or anything. It's not a curvy line or an arc or anything like that. And that linearity is a big deal, because you want your suspension to be matched to your damping, and your damping, as long as the piston speed remains the same, the damping force doesn't change. And so you want your spring rate to match that. So, because that's what you're doing. You're trying to adjust your damping to match your springs. But if your springs have a mind of their own, then you're going to have trouble getting a consistent handling out of your car. Now, it's not to say that's a terrible solution. The OEMs do it. You can get it to work. It's not like horrible, but it's not the best way to do it. And witness any purpose-built race car. Any purpose-built race car is going to have a coaxial perch. So just exactly what is a coaxial perch? A coaxial perch is a perch literally where the spring and the shock are always in the same axis, therefore they are coaxial. Now if you'll notice this mount, I'm going to move this up to the camera, you can see how the body mount is actually tilted. So that's so that it can allow the shock to swing back and forth as the control arm moves up and down. The shock swings back and forth, and there's a spherical bearing there that allows it to move freely. However, the spring perch is not moving. It's always on the shock. So as the shock moves, it moves with the shock. So it remains coaxial. So you don't have that bending that I was talking about. Now, most body mounts, the spring plane and the body plane are usually within a few millimeters of each other. This front NC shock, I think it's almost identical. There's pretty much no offset there, which means that when the shock swings back and forth here, there's not a lot of radial offset when they're this close. However, if you get a shock like the rear NC shock, and there's a lot of other mounts. Those of you who have other types of cars, you might have like an extended mount, but the NC is an extraordinary case. It's in a really, really long spring. In this case, the shock is pivoting right here, but the body is here. So when the shock swings back and forth like this, well, the spring is attached. It stays here. So what you've got is the shock moving this way, but the spring staying put. So effectively what you're doing is bending that spring side to side. So it's a motion like this. You've essentially got this weird kind of thing like this going with the spring, which is why any motorsports application for an NC or the RX-8 has a coaxial perch, and they're inverted. The only way to do it, because you can't create a perch that basically allows the spring to slide here. There's no kind of structure that would do it. It'd have to be some kind of weird, I don't even know what it would be. So the easy way to do it is flip the shock upside down, which is what we do on the NC Xida, to isolate the spring, and this is why we did we had to, because of this extreme distance. We couldn't get away with the normal billet mount that we normal billet coaxial mount. So this allows basically the spring to remain in line with the shock while the spring the shock swings back and forth. So coaxial mount, and in some cases on some cars, other brands of cars that have a long mount like that, they're probably going to be best to be inverted. So that's coaxial versus not coaxial. The other issue is Torrington bearings. So I keep forgetting to bring one out here for this video, but that's a Torrington bearing. It's this little silver thing here. It's basically like it's like two flat washers with a bunch of needle bearings arrayed radially, and allows the upper and lower washers to move independently with no friction. So that's set under the spring. And what it allows the spring to do, it allows the spring to rotate freely like this. Now, when there's no preload on it, always that's easy. But even when this thing's under maximum compression, thousands of pounds of load going through it, it'll still allow that to spin. And you think, well, why does it need to spin? Springs don't spin that way. Well, they kind of do, actually. Coil springs, when they compress, they don't just compress in line. Like if I were to fix this and fix this together, they don't compress dead in a straight line. They actually will rotate a little bit. And that rotation, it might go down and then kind of stop, or it might be where it accelerates, but there's going to be a rotation force. The problem is if you have an upper and lower mount on that coil spring and they're not allowed to move independently, not allowed to rotate independent of each other, and you compress the spring, you're actually binding the spring because it wants to spin and rotate to maintain that linear spring rate. It wants to be able to spin. So if you capture it like this, you actually change the spring rate. So it becomes, instead of that nice straight line we were talking about, it becomes nonlinear. So nonlinearity there, you're bending them this way with the parallelogram, that's nonlinearity, and then you're twisting the top even on a short body mount spring. So that linearity is a big deal, and that's the difference between basically a race car shock and just a production car shock. And it really all comes down to cost. Another factor is if you do a billet coaxial mount, you often have to, because those two pieces have to be separate, it makes the mount a little taller, it changes the stack height, and to retain bump travel so that the shock will have the same minimum length, you have to adjust the length of your shock design. So you can't usually take a shock that's designed for a body mount and just throw a coaxial mount on it, because it'll be longer. It'll be basically too long and you'll lose bump travel. So the wheel's supposed to go up to here, but it'll only go to here. You'll lose a bunch of bump travel if you try to convert a body mount to a coaxial mount. So when you design the shock from the beginning for a coaxial mount, you can retain all that bump travel. And this is an example. This is an ND, or I should say an NC Xidas for that platform, and this is the equivalent front shock, and they have the same bump travel. The tire will go up to the same distance, but this one has a coaxial mount. So because it was designed from the beginning to have that. And in the rear, we had the same thing. By putting the inverted shock in there, we're able to get the same amount of bump travel. And again, this applies to not just the Xidas for the NC, but pretty much for any shock. If you're looking for a maximum performance, look for a shock that was designed for a coaxial mount and either has an optional one or another brand that'll fit it or something. But really what you're looking for in a maximum performance type of setup for track, HPD, autocross, or just hammering the back roads and trying to get the maximum suspension performance, you want a coaxial mount if that's available to you. Hopefully that answers your questions. Visit SuperMiata.com, click the contact tab, shoot us an email, give us a call. We're here Monday through Friday, Pacific time. I'd love to talk to you about our shocks and the stuff that we do here. We'll see you at the track.